All right. Hi, everyone. This is a little bit of a quiet week because we have ZIO World coming up next week. So I think lots of people are busy getting ready for that. And I think especially coming out of that, we're going to have a lot of fun stuff to cover in our Zymposia. I heard a bunch of people were interested in more ZIO HTTP content, and we'll definitely have that. One of the things that you'll be seeing is we're very close to having a version 1 of ZIO HTTP, which I know people are very eager for that as well. And I want to have more content on that, but I want it to be the final version or pretty close to the final version, so that when people refer back to it later, it's actually answering their questions in a helpful way versus kind of another, oh, well, now it's changed a little bit. So we're very close to that, and we're going to have that, but that's not today. But what I thought could be fun is just to have a little bit of a, hopefully more interactive session. I know us software developers can be a little more introverted at times, so hopefully you can all push ourselves here. But really kind of a combination of two things of, one, if there are things that you have questions about or you want to just ask, have a chance to do that either live or on the Discord, and I'll try to answer those. And then two, if you have points of feedback of like, hey, I really wish this thing existed, or this thing doesn't really work for me the way it is right now, or the documentation for this isn't really clear, I thought it would be a good opportunity as well to get that feedback, because we're always trying to make things better, but also there's a lot of stuff in the ecosystem. So sometimes if we don't kind of have a clear direction, there may be something that you feel like is missing that just we're not getting to adding. So that is a little bit of the agenda for today. And if people are super quiet, then I'll just take a couple of the topics that people mentioned on the Discord and kind of do something on those. But hopefully we can be more interactive here. So let me go over the Discord. If you have either a question or feedback, feel free to either type something there, or if you want to, you can raise your hand, and I'm happy to hand over the mic and we can go from there. But all right, I'm going to give folks a minute here. So we have one question that's kind of not exactly a ZIO question, a Zyverge question, but yeah, I'm happy to hit on that too. Okay, so we have a question about layers that kind of, I think someone else earlier mentioned they wanted like a little bit more on layers. So why don't we, I'm going to start with that, and meanwhile I will give everyone else time to if you have any other questions, get them in here, and we'll get a nice backlog going. So let me share my screen here. Sure, I got the right one here. Okay, so let's just get a little scratch area here. Let's see, maybe we'll do it under the, maybe we'll create a new project here. ZIO QA. Oops, not file, but folder. Sorry. Okay, perfect. Okay, so yeah, one question I get, oh, you can't see the screen share. Hold on, I'm doing the wrong screen share. All right, I'm glad I looked at me. There we go. Okay, how's that? Okay. So we got a bunch of questions here. So let me maybe try to just catalog some of the questions. And oh yeah, so sorry. So someone was a little bit late. So yeah, so we're doing a little bit of a Q&A session. So I think in the Discord is a great place to do it, just so we kind of hopefully build up a little bit of a backlog, so we can kind of work through them. We don't have like pregnant pauses while we're like waiting for stuff. But also, if you want to kind of in between, if you'd rather do it by voice, I'm happy to, if you raise your hand, I'm happy to hand it over. But yeah, please feel free to share. And meanwhile, all right, so we're talking layers, and we got some questions. Let me see if I can like rephrase them. Like, how should we name layers? How should we organize layers? When should we have layers for a unit? When can layers return multiple services? Can they? Okay, all right. So I think I've hopefully captured layer questions. If you have more layer questions, feel free to throw them into Zoom, and when I check, I'll try to get them in here. So yeah, this has been an interesting area because I think overall, like, I feel like if anything, we sometimes get criticized as ZIO for being overly prescriptive about things, of like, you know, we should have like one way to do things versus having a million ways to do them. And you know, some people want the million ways to do them. And I think this is one area where I've been surprised that, like, I feel like sometimes people want a surprising amount of structure, which, you know, in a way is great. And, you know, I'm going to try to answer, but I guess I'll give that as a little bit of a preface. So just to go back to like the overall pattern for layers. So what the basic idea is kind of a very classic, like object-oriented one, is separate interfaces from implementations. So let's just let's create some simple interface. So let's say this is going to be like a user repo. Sure. And so it's going to have an interface that's going to let us find a user. And I guess if this is going to be the case, then we're going to need some kind of user for it to find. Sure, seems perfectly reasonable. And so even here, there are like a couple of patterns that we want to follow. So one thing to notice here is that the return type of user repo doesn't depend on any other services. So maybe user repo itself is going to depend on an authentication service or something like that. We don't want to put that in the return type here. We want this to be, at least if this is not failed an error, we want this environment type to be any, because any dependencies that user repo has, we want to wrap up in user repo, and we want user repo to be responsible for them versus expose them to the user, because we might have some user repos that maybe do require authentication, and maybe we have a test user repo that doesn't require authentication. So that's kind of one just important point here. So we've got this user repo, and then we're going to have different implementations of that user repo. And typically those implementations are going to have, you can think of as like two parts. So one of them is going to be like an actual class that implements it. We're usually going to do it as a case class. And so whatever, this will be DynamoDB user repo. And so we're always going to extend that user repo interface. We're obviously going to have to implement that method somehow. And any dependencies that this thing has, we're going to take as constructor parameters here. So maybe this needs some kind of authorization service. So I'm going to make some other, right? And maybe this will be like token, maybe create a little case class for this. And so if this thing needs an authorization service, then I just put that here. So we have the interface, we have the class that implements the interface, and then we're going to have a layer that builds that. And so a simple one would look like something like this. So what I always recommend is like the simplest way is just use this Z layer constructor and then give yourself a for comprehension. And then grab any service you need using the ZIO.service and then build that class. And this way you've got flexibility of if there's anything else you need to do here that's actually doing like an effect or requiring finalization, right? Maybe we need to do some logging or we need to do some other thing here. And maybe we need to do some finalization even. So maybe we do ZIO.add finalizer. And then if I do something that requires resources as well, requires finalization, all I have to do is change this to zlayer.scoped. So I always use zlayer or zlayer.scoped. I'll do a for comprehension, and that handles all of my needs as complicated basically as I could possibly get here. So this is kind of the basic pattern of we have interfaces, we have classes that implement those interfaces, and then we have layers that describe building and tearing down those classes, because the class itself is just a class. It doesn't, we don't want to use it for initialization or tear down because we don't have a way to do that in a principled way that supports all the strong guarantees we like with ZIO. So this is the pattern, and at least from my perspective, that's like the important part. Like if you do this, you're good. But I think maybe just because people want to do it in exactly the right way, or maybe because this is like more the architecture part of it. I get a lot of questions of like, and I think you can have here, like, should I call this layer or should I call this live? And I'll try to share some thoughts on it, but I guess my initial thought would be, do whatever works for you, right? I mean, as with a lot of things, it's great to be prescriptive, but someone could implement a method to accumulate some numbers, and you could call your accumulator ACK, or you could call it accumulator, or you could call it sum, and those would probably all be fine. And unless you pick something particularly obscure, if I was doing a code review, I would probably say thumbs up. So that would kind of be, I guess, my first thing of like, unless you feel like it's really important to you, like do whatever works for you. There are enough things that we need to kind of memorize, like, oh, we need to do it this particular way, that it's not a huge deal what you call these things, as long as you have some relatively logical name for them. So again, I'll try to give you some more specific thoughts for if you like do want more specific thoughts, but that would be like my initial one on that is like, don't worry too much about naming. The second thing I would think about, though, if I started to, if I was going to get more prescriptive about this, and I was going to kind of share some other ideas, is first think about how many implementations you're going to have, and also think about even separating these into different modules. So like if we go to our build file here, right now, this is all in the same questions and answers, and I'm kind of creating like a different project for each week that we do. But a lot of times what I would do if I was doing like this in kind of a industrial, right, like a kind of large organization where I'd have like maybe 100 repos, is I would have a whole bunch of different modules. And so I would take this user repo, maybe I'll put it down here, and I would put this in, I'll call it a user repo project. And then I would take this whole thing and I would put it in a completely different project. I would put it in a, I'll call it a, whatever, Dynamo DB user repo project that depends on the user repo project. And then if I had some other project that was using a user repo, so let's imagine I have something that's like, let's not even wire that up yet. Let's say it has something else like create user service. And let's say this is gonna let us do something else with this. Let's say this is gonna let us like update the user. And then I'll have some other. So I'd also put this in its own project. So maybe I'll call this in user service project. And then I would have some, maybe I'll call this so user service project here would, or a user service live here, would depend on user repo, but not on DynamoDB user repo. And so this enforces, oh, let me see what I did here. Oh, I think so this enforces a really nice degree of separation where no one else gets to rely on the specific implementation of this DynamoDB user repo, or maybe this one has some other methods that are being used to help implement this. No one gets to see that because they only get to depend on this user repo. And then we only wire these things together in our main application. So maybe here, where we extend ZIO at default, we're going to provide all these things. And it's only here, this main project gets to depend on the DynamoDB user repo. So that both enforces a really nice degree of separation, and at least if you end up using more of like a mono repo type architecture, it actually really helps a lot in compilation times, because what it means is that all of these different modules can be compiled in parallel, because all of each of them depend on, except for that main one, which get compiled at the very end, all of them just depend on these other interfaces. So we can compile them all at the same time. So that's one pattern that I would really recommend and has worked well for me. As far as the naming, again, I don't think it's a huge deal. I think sometimes if you do this, then I think the layer can be a good name because already it's clear from just the name of this thing, DynamoDB user, oh, I don't need user. It's DynamoDB user repo dot layer, and just the fact that it's DynamoDB user, it's kind of, it is the live one. It's not a test one. If you just had a test one, it would just be a user repo. The DynamoDB already kind of implies that it's live. So I mean, I think the layer can be good there, but also sometimes if you may have multiple ones here with different options for them or something, and you may want to give it a more descriptive name. So I wouldn't get too worried about the names. I would really focus on this idea of separate out, you have these three things, right? We have the interface, we have the class that implements the interface, and then we have the layer that constructs that class. And if you do that, you're already in great shape. And I think if you use this pattern of defining these in actually like separate compilation modules, then you're kind of even one step ahead in both keeping things compiling nicely and not taking forever when you're working in very large projects, as well as just making things nice and modular and making sure that people aren't relying on implementation details. One other pattern that I find is pretty useful is if I have a lot of layers to create what you could say, I guess, some logical groupings of them. So a lot of times, and I think some of this is just, it's a little bit hard to show in these little demo sessions because by definition, like it's not a industry sized project, but typically in like these little demos, we'll have maybe 5 or 6, maybe up to a dozen layers or something. And then it can kind of make a lot of sense to just provide them all here. If you have like 100 layers, having a list of 100 things gets a little bit unruly. So what I'll often do is I'll try to group them into some logical categories. And exactly what those categories are may vary between your app, but you may have something like Val user services. And you may say, look, there are a dozen different components that all go together eventually to support this, this user service thing. And so what I would do is I would say, okay, well, this is going to be something that maybe this is going to not depend on anything else, but it's going to return one of these user service things. And I can use this zlayer.make operator and specify the type. So I could say, okay, make a user service. And this is just like provide, except instead of automatically putting these layers together and providing them to this thing, they're going to automatically put them together and give me something that eventually gives this. So like here, if I had, let's see if I can maybe make this feel slightly more real. So like this might be a Z layer. So this is going to depend on a, what do we say this depends on? This is going to depend on a user repo. I think I may, oh, okay, I think I need this defined separately from when I have this to do this. So maybe I'll just do this as like a little bit of an illustrative thing. But basically here, I would do user service live.layer, and then maybe this is going to require the DynamoDB user repo.layer, and then that's going to require the authorization service. And so this is really the only point that these start to know about each other's existence, right? The DynamoDB user repo, maybe it knew that it needed an authorization service. It didn't know about this layer. And these all get created, and maybe I have a dozen of them here, and they package all this up. And then maybe I have a couple of other similar groupings of, let's say, 10 roughly each. And then when if I maybe have 100 services, well, then here to my main application, I only provide these bundles of kind of my 10 big services here. Okay, that was me talking a decent amount, and I see people have been typing. So let me just scroll back over here, and then we'll keep going. So someone said, would an app generator help this? Like, yes, yes, it would. And I think someone is working on that. So that will definitely be coming, and I think that will help here. Though, I'm sure it's not going to kind of capture every variant you might have, but I think just having something to work off of would be tremendously helpful. And yeah, so Adrian also makes a good point that it's a little bit of, again, like kind of style here of this class. It can just be defined as its own top level thing. And I think that's fine, especially when this is a project that you only depend on in your main when you wire everything together. But if you wanted to make this even more private, you could take this and you could put this in here and make this private. That's a totally fine thing to do. I actually kind of like that myself, but I think some other people like having this be a top level thing just because there often is a decent amount of logic here, and it makes it, I think, feel a little bit more like traditional constructor-based dependency injection. Okay, so then we have, what if user services is several services? Yeah, so there's nothing at all that says a layer has to return just one service. And in fact, the layer can return more than one service. So if we wanted to, we could have something that like returns a user service and some other service. I think the one thing I would think about there is, do you want to expose those services to your downstream users? And it can really go both ways. So like if we had this authorization service here, does the authorization service need to be used by other people who are consuming this layer? Or is the authorization service really just a tool that the user service needs, but that other people, as long as the user service does what it needs to do, they don't need to know about the authorization service. And in fact, in the future, the authorization service might not exist, or it might be refactored 10 different ways. So I think generally, if you can, it's nice to hide those dependencies if they really are just needed for the implementation of the service. But you may have other cases where you have 10 different, all 10 of these different major parts of your graph need the authorization service. And then it's totally fine to kind of pass those downstream if downstream components really are going to need those. Okay. I think that addressed the questions on layers. Does anyone have more questions on layers while we are talking about them? See, one person's typing, so I'm going to give a minute here. So we have, I'm never sure how fine grained they should be. Yeah, it's a good question, because I think this gets to a little bit of like architecture in general, or I mean, really kind of coding style even of what works for you. I mean, just like you can have one big method, or you can have a lot of little methods. You can have one big service, or you can have a lot of smaller services. I think it's hard to give kind of objective like criteria for that. I think do what works for you. I think generally it's there's nothing wrong with having small services, and I think that can make the logic of them very clear. So I would say if I was in doubt about something, just make it its own service. I think that can often just kind of clarify like the contract of something and say, okay, this thing just is responsible for doing this one simple thing. And I think on larger teams, it can also be helpful to kind of have like a division of responsibility where you're like, so-and-so, like your thing is to make the DynamoDB user repo amazing. And you're like, okay, got it. I'm gonna own that. I'm gonna make that thing awesome. But yeah, I don't know if I can give you more quantitative guidance than that. I'll give a minute for Adrian here. Okay, so this is an interesting one that I think gets a little bit beyond just layers. Depending on how to approach projects to be converted from CATS to ZIO, more particularly dealing with passing fiber ref values between these two worlds. Yeah, so there's a couple of operators. So what it's called get fiber refs. Let's see, was that going to click through for me? Maybe not. Let me switch my share and go to actual ZIO. Hold on a second. So there's this get fiber ref value. It's just going to get you all of the fiber refs. So if you kind of have like all the fiber refs and you just want to get them, you could get that, and then you could kind of bring them over to the CATS effect world. Or if you're in that world and you, or if you have specific ones, you can get those. And unfortunately, when you kind of go from one to the other, you've got to kind of get everything out of one and put it into the other, and vice versa. So if possible, it's easier said than done, but it's always easier when you're kind of always in the ZIO world versus you're going back and forth. But otherwise, the pattern you generally want to follow is you want to, when you go from ZIO to spec, you want to grab the fiber ref values that are important to you and put them in there. And then when you go back the other way, you also want to grab those. So that's I guess the kind of high level of how you approach that. Does that help? Okay, cool. I'm going to go back to the other screen share. Okay, so let me go back and look at a couple of other things, and definitely feel free to jump in, or let me quickly. It looks like okay. It looks like we don't have any hand raises, so I'll just go through the Discord. But definitely, I'll check in again in a minute or two if you do want to do stuff that way. So yeah, so it seems like there's a lot of kind of seconding of the like having a tool would be to generate something would be very cool, and I totally agree with that. So yeah, I think we're going to have more of that coming. There was one question about kind of having a like ZIO roadmap. I think if you listen to some of our talks, like you won't be completely surprised by what you see coming. Like I think if you listen to the talks at Functional Scala last year, like what you're going to hear at ZIO World is not going to be completely surprising. I think there's a little bit of a balance there of just wanting to have a plan, but also being a ZIO is not a corporation or anything, right? There's no one who like gets to say, oh, like, I'm paying you, so you need to do X. It's kind of people who are donating their time and are doing things that they're excited about, are sometimes inspired and sometimes busy with other things in life. And so, I think there's some danger of that, of kind of either committing to things that kind of can't be honored, or kind of creating a situation where like you don't take advantage of kind of spontaneous insights. But I think, I mean, I can definitely answer that like a little bit. And I think if you listen to Functional Scala, you'll have heard this, or if you come to ZIO World, you hear this. But I think the big roadmap is to have really a full stack solution for ZIO, right? I think the goal for ZIO is to be the next generation of Spring, say, and take the good things of like, hey, this was like a framework that gave you everything you needed to build applications, and not the bad things of, well, have these like weird things that were not principled and you couldn't work with in a way that made sense. And so I think ZIO is like very, very foundational. And I think at this point, pretty mature. We're going to continue to be doing stuff to make it better. And you'll hear about some of that from John at ZIO World next week. But that's already in like a very good place for people to build on. And I think what we're really focused on is kind of what you could call like the core stack on top of that you would need to build a application that did all the basic things you need. And so ZIO HTTP is super critical to that. If you just look at activity, John and Daniel and a variety of other ZIO contributors have been spending a ton of time on that. You're going to hear about that next week. That's a huge focus area. And then I think there's another set of libraries that are kind of around that, of logging is super important there, config is super important there, metrics is important. Persistence is already in a very good shape with ZIO Quill, but that's another kind of core component of that. And so I think the roadmap right now at a high level is have all of those things at a really solid point where they work, they serve all the use cases you would have, they are well documented, they fit together nicely, and it's really a joyful experience to build an application that start to finish uses ZIO. And you don't have to use any of these other things. You don't have to kind of go back and forth and do interop. Within each of those libraries, there are going to be like specific things if they're working on this feature or that feature. But I think if you wanted a high level roadmap, that's the roadmap. All right, I'll let the person who asked that kind of respond if they have other stuff. I see one question about more about layers, so I'll come back to that for a second. So there's a question about layers that return unit. So you may see a signature that's like Z layer any nothing unit instead of Z layer any nothing user service. And this would be a layer that just like you could have a ZIO any nothing unit or a ZIO whatever any nothing string, right? This is a ZIO that returns a string. This is a ZIO that doesn't return any value, does some kind of side effect, right? It writes to a database or it sends a notification, it does something. And similarly, you can have a layer that produces a user service, or you can have a layer that doesn't produce a service, but does some side effect, right? Maybe it opens a port. Maybe it sets some type of configuration. And I think if you can use this pattern of kind of return values and have those values be consumed by other things, I think that's a great pattern. So that would always be my starting point. And this is also going to help the automatic layer construction algorithm because it's going to know where dependencies exist, right? If you have something that produces a user service and you have something else that takes a user service, then we know that we need to build this before we build this. And then we need to tear this down before we tear this down. If these just return units, we don't have that information. So if you can return some type of value and consume it, I think that's a great pattern. That would kind of be my starting point. But if you have some things that like they just legitimately don't return a value, right? They open the port and the port needs to be open for something else to do what it's going to do, but they don't return the port. They just do this thing on the side of opening it, then it is what it is. And the unit is the appropriate way to indicate that. So I would approach a little bit of like looking at what things are actually doing in the world and then reflecting that in your types. Adrian, definitely let me know if that answered your question there. Okay. Let me go back and see what other ones we have. So we have a question about ZIO JSON. So I don't know a question about that API. So I think that would be a great issue to raise if that's something you're interested in and you would like to see more of. There's a question about documentation, and yeah, I continue to work on ZIO and you got about I think more than 500 pages of content there, but I do kind of have to keep updating that for various things we're doing. The other source of information is obviously the documentation that's been built out a lot on the ZIO website. If you haven't checked that out, I would encourage you to check that out. And we've actually got some pretty cool stuff in the works to try to make that even better. But the other thing I would say there is like that's a really valuable area for like you to give feedback on like, hey, like this specific thing I would like more documentation on, because I think it's one of those things that it's kind of, it's a little bit like a bottomless well, right? Of like the documentation can always be better. And at this point, there are a lot of different ZIO projects, like you could always do more. So it's like really helpful there for someone to say like, hey, I'd like more on X, right? Because that's like a very solvable thing of like, hey, there's not a page on X, or there's only a paragraph on X, and there should be a whole section on X. Versus if it's just documentation should be better, like, yes, documentation should always be better, but what's the action item there? What else? Also, it's totally fine to just like make this a conversation about like feedback. So if there's just like, hey, this thing is awesome, or this thing is sucky for me, like that's also totally fine too. It doesn't have to be like a question. It can also be a comment. And also, okay, someone's raised their hand. So let me try to do this thing. Let's see if I can. All right, you're good to go.
All right, hi.
Hi.
I just joined. I heard you were talking about layers, and I wanted to know if there was any way you could maybe tie in from like MacWire and the like a module type pattern into ZIO Z layers. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but I've been trying to figure that out where like you have modules of code and each module sort of has its own dependency injection for that module. And then you have one, you know, sort of like a pyramid scheme of provide, if you will.
So I think that's, I mean, it's definitely is conceptually, I think the same. It's not like it will just automatically translate, but I think that's what that zlayer.make is. So I think, at least if I'm kind of conceptually describing it, and I mean, tell me if I'm wrong here, is like in the simplest world where you just do provide, you can kind of think of it as it's like a linear graph, right? If you say, well, we have like the main application, and it depends on service A, and service B, and service C. And so you kind of have just like a one level graph here. And your question, I think, if I'm not completely butchering it, is kind of how do you describe a graph that looks more like this and do it in a modular way? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, I got some screaming babies.
No worries at all. So yeah, so there are kind of two approaches you could have to this. So like the, I'll call one maybe the like flat approach. And so one would be, you still define your layers like this. So let me just define maybe trait A, trait B, oops, C, D, E, F. So then we could have something like, we could have this like file C layer is a Z layer that needs a D and E and F. It can't fail, and it makes a C. And then B layer doesn't need anything. It makes a B. A layer doesn't need anything, makes an A. Every else I'm doing is in opposite alphabetical order. And then let me just do these. So D layer makes a D, E layer makes an E, and F layer makes an F. And so if I have these, so these layers do reflect that kind of structure I have here. And so then to put them together, there are kind of two ways I can do it. So one thing I could do is I could just do provide, and I could just give it all these different layers. And as long as I do provide, which is going to do the automatic layer construction, it's going to kind of realize that C needs D, E, and F, and it'll put them together. So that's kind of one way to do it. That's simple, but you could say maybe it's like a little bit like anti-modular, that like you need to do all of these at once versus you'd like to kind of hide these a little bit. And so that's where that zlayer.make comes in. So the second way you could do it is you could have a new layer. Maybe I call this like D layer assembled or something. That's probably not the best name, but just. And so this is going to be a layer that doesn't need anything else, then produces D. And so this could be zlayer dot make. And I could just give this, oh, I'm sorry, this needs to produce C. And this could just be C layer D, E, and F. And then I could take my main application and I could just provide, let's see if I got this right. Yeah, A, B.
Oh, okay.
And sorry, this should be C layer assembled. C layer assembled. So that's, I think, the way to do it that maybe captures that like modularity that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think 100% that does, because that way, like, because when you're using like MacWire, you can have these modules, and you have like some pocket of your code that's got all these services and a config and its own database connection and its own stuff. And you have another section, and they may route to like the same controller, but you've got two different modules of dependency injection going on, where you might need like to class tag or whatever. And so that's that. I didn't know that make existed. So that's pretty nice that you can just call make, and then you can pass make or that layer, because I guess it's just a layer. Nice.
Elsewhere. Yeah. Okay.
Super cool.
Yay, Q&A. Okay, well, let me just. So the question is, through which channel would this feedback be most useful? I guess my initial answer is going to be any and all. You know, I'll take it by rain or snow or however you want to give it. But I mean, I think ZIO Discord is great. I think potentially if we wanted to, we could kind of open like an issue of like things to work on documentation for, and people could comment there if we thought that was more helpful. I'm totally open, but I think initially just whatever way you want to share the feedback. Okay, let's see. We've got a question from Manfred. Let's assume I've got a non-ZIO library that watches for changed files in a given path and publishes files to a queue. Are there best practice to run effects when I work with non-ZIO libraries? I don't know if there's so much a so the question basically best practices for and I'm just gonna see if I can okay. So best practice for interfacing between ZIO and non-ZIO libraries. So I think a good starting point is, if you can, just wrap everything in a ZIO. So a lot of times I'll say, if we have some interface, let's just call it trait legacy API, and we have something of, let's say this is whatever user. The very first thing I would do with these is I would just basically create my trait, pick your name, ZIO legacy API, and I would have exactly the same thing, except I would make it a ZIO, and I would basically just wrap every operation in ZIO succeed or another ZIO constructor. And yeah, someone said ZIO.attempt is there. So that's kind of the easy case, and so this is basically making it easier to call into legacy code from ZIO code. Now, the case that's a little bit even more challenging, but just the other way that can go is where you need to call into ZIO code from legacy code, right? And so I think that's what this person's talking about here is they have some type of file watcher service. And maybe they have something that's like make file watcher, and we have some like sealed trait file event. And so when you make this file watcher, you give it maybe some function that is going to return this thing. And so you could imagine under the hood, this is going to create some thread that's just going to be running in the background, watching these files. And every time it sees one of these files events, it's just going to call this function. And so the normal way we would do this if we were kind of not working with ZIO is we would just do like make file watcher, and then we do some kind of pattern match, right? Maybe this has some case object like file created name, then file event. And so we would just do make file watcher, and we would do file created, and well, we wouldn't do ZIO debug, but we would just do like print line here or something. And sorry, let me just comment this out just so. Oops. And my little examples that actually compile here. So let me start this wrong. And so in that case, if we want to use this API and we want to do some kind of ZIO thing, like instead we want to offer this event to a queue, then we've got to unsafely run it. And I don't think there's anything, I guess, that special. It's just it's a problem that is a common problem you run into. So there's some ZIO tools to deal with it. So what I would typically do there is I would get a runtime, and oftentimes the default one is a good one to go with. So I would do runtime.default, and then here instead of this, I could do something like runtime.default.unsafe.run. And then there's fiber failure. And then because we want to make it extra sure, you really want to do this, we have this unsafe thing. This runtime here. And then, oh, this is all this. And so that would be basically the way I would do that. And if I wanted to, if I ended up calling this a lot, maybe I would just extract this out into my own method, right? Maybe I have something of like def unsafe run sync. And I just kind of grab all this if I just say, well, I already know this is unsafe, so don't remind me of it and don't make me give that. I don't know why that's not, So that's basically the pattern I would use when I needed to call into ZIO from legacy code. And there's nothing, just use the runtime, use this unsafe, and if you need to do it, you need to do it, right? In the perfect world, everything's in ZIO and you never need to do it, but if you need to do it, you do it, and there's nothing to kind of stress out about there. Okay. And Manfred, please let me know if that answered your question there. Yeah, GitHub Docs could be another good tool for that. And yeah, Adrian has a good comment about there's also the make sum. So the make says that the thing you're making isn't going to depend on anything else. It's going to have this return type of any. So like the subcomponent is complete versus there's one called make sum. If you want to say, well, the subcomponent still needs something else. And then you can say what that other thing is that you need. Yeah, so there's always a little bit of a trade-off of kind of, I guess, how magical you want to make things, and magical can be nice, but can sometimes also maybe make things a little bit more cryptic. So yeah, if we didn't like this and we wanted this to be, I guess, even nicer, we could, you could imagine. Well, so I guess one level would be you could have something like implicit class, like run ZIO syntax. And I can basically just grab this. And then I could make this maybe even nicer if I could just do. This doesn't need this. There. This doesn't. So that's like one further step. And then I guess if you really wanted to kind of port disaster, you could do like implicit like def like ZIO to a and then I could just do like val. Well, I won't do ZIO.debug, but I could just do like val a string, yeah, is equal to ZIO.succeed flow. Let's see, interesting, it's not coming up, but yeah, I probably would not advise doing this anyway, but I guess that would be the extreme of ways you could do that, but yeah, that's probably not a good idea. Okay, let's see. I think we are caught up here. We are at about the hour mark here, so maybe this is a good time to take stock a bit. Maybe I'll give people one more chance, so if you got comments or questions, throw them out and I will try to hit on them, and otherwise we will call it a day here, and hopefully at least some of us will see each other in ZIO World. All right, well, again, thank you all for joining. Hopefully this is just like the start of a conversation. Yeah, we have these symposiums every week, and yeah, we're always looking for more ideas. I think after ZIO World, we'll probably have a good amount of stuff of just talking about different things that are coming. But if there's something that you would like to see more of, please, you can either just put it in the Discord or open an issue on the Zymposium repo or message me yourself, however you feel comfortable doing it. But please, share any ideas of things you'd like to see. And then please, continue to share any feedback you have. Like, that's how ZIO keeps getting better. And yeah, I think that idea of maybe having like a discussion of documentation improvement opportunities is a good idea. So yeah, I'd love to kind of keep just following up on all this stuff. But thank you all so much. All right, take care, everyone.